Uh, Welcome to UT Brainstorms. My name is Mike Mock, and I'm a professor in the Department of Neuroscience and here at UT. And wow, is it nice to be back. We've missed this, and we're so happy that, yeah. And this wasn't a part of my little thing that I had planned, but what a delight it's been to bump into you and say hi to all familiar faces. And just out of curiosity, for how many of you is this the first Brainstorms? Okay, fantastic. So we started this in 2017. We did 3.5 seasons when COVID drove us onto Zoom. We did a 3.5, 4. We did a couple of seasons on Zoom, and then when we decided to come back and start doing live events again, we discovered that the money situation was different, and so we stopped for a while, and we've been raising money because I get emails all the time from people saying, "Where's Brainstorms? Where's Brainstorms?" And so here we are, and so it's fun to be back, right? So the gist of it here now then is that we'll have about a 40-minute presentation about tonight's topic, which is human memory. And then you'll probably notice that we did a bait and switch. I usually do the first one because it's just easier to do that than it is to try to get my colleagues to come do one. And I had wanted Dr. Michael Drew to be one of the panelists, and I had wanted Dr. Allie Preston to do the other one. Allie, I thought, was still in the provost's office, and I thought she's too busy, and my real goal in contacting her is that she would tell me a couple of good postdocs who could come. So when she said, "Sure, I'd be happy to," I said, "Well," so she's the speaker tonight, and I'm going to be a panelist along with Michael. And trust me, that for tonight's topic, that's a big upgrade, okay? So we'll do about 40 minutes. Give us a couple of minutes to rearrange things, and then we'll do question and answer until 8:25, or you run out of questions. You probably saw that QR code, so you can ask questions there. You can ask questions on that as the talk goes on. Some of you don't like such things, and so we'll alternate between questions with the microphone. We have a couple of our Synapse members running around, and then we'll take questions that you've submitted. We'll take questions from the microphone, and that way we'll keep things going. I wanted to mention that how many Synapse people are in the room at the moment? So Synapse is a program. It's a club for UT neuroscience majors. And how many people do you have in Synapse now? Just say a number.
100.
100? It used to be 20, and now it's 100. So they graciously volunteered to come help if you had people shepherding you along. So we had, 20 some odd Synapse members. It's a fantastic club, and so I wanted to acknowledge and thank you guys. I know it was hot out there, so thank you. We have 9 of these scheduled for the year. They're not all, the dates aren't firm yet, but we'll do October, November, skip December, and then we'll do January through June. If fundraising goes according to plan, we'll soon be moving back over to the LBJ auditorium where we were before, so we can have as big a crowd as we want. We actually didn't invite the undergraduates tonight because we had 510 people register, so we had to cut off registration. So anyway, without further delays on my part, tonight's speaker is Dr. Allie Preston. She got her PhD at the same place I did, the psychology department at Stanford in 2004. Mine was a long time before that. She did a postdoc there too. We hired her in 2007, where she did the whole tenure, advanced to full professor. She's done a bunch of wonderful things leadership-wise. She was interim vice VP for research for a while. She was in the provost's office. And I have to say, on a personal note, I'm really glad she's done with all that, because I get to see her in the hallway these days, and it's fun to have her back. So anyway, Dr. Allie Preston.
So thank you all for coming this evening. I love to do these talks. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so I actually am a neuroscientist who studies the human brain, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And it's always fun to actually come to these audiences and really interact with you and see the impact of the kind of work that we do as neuroscientists and what it means to all of you in real-world contexts. So again, if you want to download this app now, this is a great way to submit your questions. I'll put this up at the end of the talk too, but again, we'll have the mics if you have questions. So I'm going to talk and then we'll take all your questions at the end. But if you have a question in the midst, write it down. We'll see it. So I'm going to talk to you about the remembering brain, and I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit about the early stages of learning and memory, and how changes in brain development impact how we learn, remember, and make decisions throughout our lifespan. So as a cognitive neuroscience, I actually studied children as young as 4 and all the way up through healthy aging to the age of 95. But it's hard to fit all of that information into a single talk, so I'm going to focus on the early stages tonight. So one thing I think about what I study in my lab is how we become wise. And obviously with age comes wisdom. And we can think about, what I'm going to answer today is whether children and teens' brains are actually even ready to be wise. And so one thing we can think about is, what is wisdom? So anybody what's your definition of wisdom? You want to shout some out? Experience, learning from mistakes, that's a good one. Patience. Yes, those are all good. Diverse thinking, that's a good one too, yes. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these things. So what I think of as wisdom, and I think it's many things, but how I'm going to conceptualize it tonight is that wisdom is, of course, accumulated over time. You as infants, obviously, aren't wise because they haven't had enough experience to be wise. So some of the audience said, right, experience. But I think what I'm going to talk about today is, even if you normalize for experience, children's and teens' brains might not be ready to even benefit from that level. And so one thing we actually have to think about is how we acquire wisdom is that we derive knowledge across all the experiences we have. We don't just encode snapshots of our life. We actually think about things as we're learning and relating to the things we already know. So as you sit in this talk tonight, you might think about how you think about memory and learning and making decisions and relating what I say to your existing knowledge. And that's what I'm going to talk about, maybe have a long developmental trajectory. And so really, the way I think about memory, while most of our definitions of memory are to think about our ability to recollect and reflect and retrospectively think about what's happened to us, really why the brain spends all its computational power storing what we experience is not to think about the past, but rather to act about the present and think about the future, right? So our brains are actually prediction machines where we're building and accumulating knowledge to be able to make wise decisions based on that experience in the future. And so I'm going to talk about this intersection between learning, memory, and decision-making across a few examples tonight. So one of my favorite Miles Kingston is a British satirist, and so this is one of the best kind of cute ways to think about what wisdom is and how that differs from memory or knowledge itself. So knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad, right? So I can know that fact, but what I do with that fact is what's really important to me when I'm behaving. So again, what I'm going to talk about today is really our children and children here. I'm going to talk mostly about children in grammar school, so about the age of 6 or 7, all the way through adolescence into emerging adulthood. We're going to talk about how their changes in brain structure and function change how they learn and remember and maybe make them not capable of being wise in the way that an adult, mature brain is able to do. And so you might ask, how do we do this? How do we study children and teens' brains? So my lab takes advantage of some great core facilities here at the University of Texas at Austin, known as the Biomedical Imaging Center. So we use big MRI machines where we stick our participants in scanners and we measure changes in their brain state as they do various learning and memory tasks. So that picture, actually, it's my son going in the scanner right there and some of my lab members. And so if you the teenager, so we're always looking for participants like 7 and up, particularly like 7 to 15 is what we're concentrating now. So if you or somebody you know is interested in participating in these studies, you can take this QR code and check out our website because we're always looking for volunteers for our research. So we use these techniques to measure people as they're behaving and doing different tasks. And so first I'll just give you a couple facts about what have we learned about brain development by using these kinds of techniques, by sticking children in scanners and measuring the structure and function of their brains. So one thing we know about the developing human brain is that it takes a long time for the communication lines to mature. So, different neurons will have, neurons are the gray matter in your brain, so they'll have cell bodies that are actually gray matter, and then how they talk to each other is through axons, which are what you know as white matter. And so those white matter communications, those communication lines, take a long time to mature. So here's kind of a 3D rendering of a 5-year-old's brain. The top image is that you're looking at the side, and then the back of the brain is on the left, the front of the brain is on the right, and then the bottom is as if you're looking top down on somebody's brain. And on the top is the front of the brain, and on the bottom is the back of the brain. And so what's being plotted here is the maturity of those communication lines. And so less mature is in red, and more mature is in the blue and purple range. So you can see there's some spots in blue at the very back of the brain and in the middle of the brain. Anybody want to guess what those parts of the brain do? Motor regions, that's the big swath in the middle. That's primary somatosensory and motor cortex right there. And the very back is your occipital lobe, which is for vision, right? So those kind of parts of your brain that are related to kind of sensory motor function do develop early because that's critical, right? That you have those skills and abilities online early. So what do we all think the red parts are for? Reasoning, decision-making, planning, right? Those are the prefrontal cortex. And so if I show you how the brain changes from preteens to teenage years to 20-year-olds, you can see how long it takes the human brain to develop these lines of communication. It turns out that the white matter tracks, these lines of communication, aren't fully developed until the 3rd decade of life. Human brains are not mature until the age of 24 and 25. So even undergraduates actually are still having developing brains. And so that's really important for us to think about how these large-scale changes in brain structure are having consequences for how you learn, remember, and make decisions, right? Because a 5-year-old's brain is certainly not the same as a 20-year-old's brain. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So we can also look at, gray matter changes, so how the actual cell bodies in different parts of the brain. And so here I'm just highlighting a few critical parts of the brain that are part of memory networks. So in green is a part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which we saw as a late developing brain. The hippocampus is in blue is one of the most well-known brain regions for memory. So if you were to have damage to this area, you would actually have a lot of problems with memory. This is one of the first areas impacted, for instance, in Alzheimer's disease. Is impacted by the hippocampus. But other regions in the in association cortex, for instance, the lateral parietal cortex, are also very important for memory. And so these memory setters also have long developing time courses. Their cell bodies and their structure changes through development. And I'm just going to show you one example from my lab. So this is an MR image from a child's brain, and in that white box is the hippocampus. And here I've just shown you blow-ups of that white box, and we can go in and we can draw out the different parts of the hippocampus, and we can measure its volume, so how big it is. And so that's what I'm showing you here, is how the size of the hippocampus changes from 5 years to 30 years. And you can see it's not a linear change, right, in development. There's some increases through adolescence and then some decreases into adulthood. And that's largely related to something called pruning. So when you start out, you have a lot of connections. A lot of your brain cells are talking a lot to each other. But in adolescence, they go through pruning, and you winnow them down to the most kind of essential connections. And that's why you see these nonlinear developmental trajectories also. But again, you can see these things are changing again into the 3rd decade of life. So the human brain takes a long time to reach its mature state. Okay, so given what we know about the kind of structural changes that are happening in the human brain, until about 20 years ago, this wasn't kind of underappreciated, and we thought that learning and memory in a 6-year-old was just like learning and memory in an adult. And so that actually is not the case. In the past 20 years, many people like me have sought to show this, right, both behaviorally and through these neural mechanisms. So we know that kind of learning and memory behaviors continue to improve through adulthood. But one of the things that I'm going to focus on a lot tonight is how children and adolescents are less likely to make these connections between learning events, right? They're less likely to benefit from their collective knowledge, to learn things that go beyond what they directly experience. And that that inability to connect things across experiences is going to have consequences for how they reason and make decisions about the world. Right? So why my lab and why many of us think about memory's relationship to reasoning is that reasoning is actually central to wise decision making in many domains. You use reasoning almost in everything you do in everyday life. These are some examples from the academic sphere. Reasoning is, of course, key to mathematics, right? My son's in geometry right now, and so all he spends his time doing is writing proofs, which again are like a form of reasoning. You can have logical, conditional, like reasoning propositions, right? One of the most famous reasoning things, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal, right? You can think of premises from logic like that. You can also think about, we often reason about space and how we interact with our world. So this is a famous reasoning task called the Raven's progressive matrices. And so your job here is to fill in what shape should go in this box, given the premises across the rows and the columns there. But also reasoning plays a role in things like literature, right? So metaphor and analogy are forms of reasoning. So mapping one set of premises to another. So dating is like flying. At some point, your feet are going to leave the ground, right? To be able to understand that, you have to reason about the linguistic premises and how to relate that to something you know to something maybe you don't have familiarity with, like dating. So how do we reason? So, of course, we manipulate and recombine premise arguments to reach a logical conclusion. That's my definition of reasoning. And for a long time, people who studied reasoning just focused on things like executive function and cognitive control, right? Things that were not related to memory. And because they often involve things like I showed here, where all the premise arguments are available to you, and that happens like a lot in academic context for the most part, but sometimes not. I would argue that in the real world, we often don't have all the premise arguments in front of us. We actually have to reason from memory, right? And so we use our memories to reason. So what I learn in one situation is brought to mind to help me reason about how to think about what's happening to me right now. And so I'm going to talk about these intersections between memory and reasoning. And one powerful way that memory helps reasoning is that it helps us link information learned at different times to generalize, as I mentioned, to apply what I learned in one setting to a new one, but also form new knowledge. Because if I didn't make these connections, if we as humans didn't make connections between our experiences, we would be very rigid, inflexible organisms. We would only be able to act based on what we directly experience. If we weren't drawing these kind of conclusions about how things are related to one another, we would not be wise, right? That's the premise here. So I'm going to give you a kind of a lay example of how adults use memory to become wise. And I think, again, of memory as a constructive process where individual events are building blocks. So I'm going to give you a toy example here. So imagine the house that you next door to you was recently for sale, and you notice this gentleman leave the front door with his dog to walk his dog, right? And you might think, okay, that's my new neighbor. And maybe you activate a kind of neural code, a distributed part of your brain that represents all the sights, sounds, smells, and thoughts that you have associated with this event. And then 2 weeks later, you again see this very same dog, but now being walked by a woman in a park, right? And so you might say that here's this kind of same dog, and that dog, because it shares content with an existing memory, might reactivate your previous experience with that dog. Right? So here you might actually, when learning the new event, connect the two things together. That is, activate an overlapping population of neurons or brain cells that represent these two experiences similarly in your brain. And the benefit of that is that you not only learn things that you directly experience, so the gray arrows here that you learn the man and the dog share a relationship and the woman and the dog share a relationship, but you can infer that the man and the woman share a relationship. And you might infer, in fact, that she is also your neighbor and lives in the house next door to you, even though you've never seen her on your street at the house next door to you. So that if you have a misplaced piece of mail, right, delivered to your house, and you see either of these people, you can give that piece of mail to them. So this kind of memory linking and using memories as building blocks allows our memories to go beyond direct experience and can help us form predictions that allow us to make novel decisions given future kind of circumstances. So one thing that we can ask to look at how these kind of behaviors differ across development is, do children and teens actually reactivate memories the same way as adults, right? Do they even think about the man and the dog in the situation like this when experiencing the woman and the dog the second time? And so you might ask, how do we do that? How do we actually read out what you're thinking about when learning new things? And so I'm going to tell you how we do that using our functional neuroimaging. So we give people a task very similar to this man, woman, dog example that I just gave you, but here they're just kind of arbitrary picture pairs. So you might see that barrel on one occasion, you have to learn that it goes with the backpack. And then several seconds later, you might see the barrel again, but this time it's paired with Pinocchio, right? And so we have people learn these associations between these image pairs, but they actually see them repeatedly. So you'll see the barrel in the backpack again and Pinocchio on the barrel again. And so in this interleaved manner, you can learn about these overlapping image pairs. And so what you might imagine here is that the first time you see the barrel in the backpack, you might not reactivate anything because you haven't seen Pinocchio yet. But that second time that you see the barrel in the backpack, because you've seen an interleaving trial where the barrel has been paired with Pinocchio, you might start reactivating Pinocchio, right? You might start thinking about him and connecting these three images together in your mind. And that might increase again as you see a further repetition. So the idea here is we're going to look at how people think about Pinocchio when they're learning about the barrel and the backpack in this task. And so to do that, we actually use kind of machine learning algorithms from artificial intelligence, and we take parts of the brain related to visual processing, which tend to react differently when viewing simple objects versus viewing pictures of people like this. And we can train a neural classifier, so basically a machine learning algorithm, to recognize the brain patterns that are associated with viewing objects and viewing faces, right? So we can teach them to do that. And then we can teach that trained classifier to look for reactivation of Pinocchio as people study the barrel and the backpack across these repetitions. And so we can test the hypothesis that, across these repetitions, people of different ages might reactivate these related items at different levels. And importantly, we're going to relate this to inference performance. So here they're actually asked at the end of this task, which of these cartoon characters shares a relationship with the backpack? And of course, the correct answer is Pinocchio. They will have seen the other cartoon characters, but they will have been related to other image pairs. And so here we can look at how much the reactivation allows them to make these simple reasoning decisions in this task. And so the hypothesis is, if we have children here about 7 to 10 years old, so the 3 dots in the purple are meant to be how children reactivate Pinocchio across the 3 repetitions. So we don't expect that children will reactivate that information at all because their brain, their memory centers that involve this kind of behavior are immature. Adults in the orange, again, 3 dots are the repetitions. We might expect them on the first trial to show no evidence for reactivation because they haven't seen Pinocchio yet. But on the second and third repetitions, they'd start to reactivate Pinocchio when they see the barrel and the backpack. And a real question is what happens in adolescence. Will they look like children? Will they look like adults? Or will they look different? So here the pattern is meant to be they initially reactivate, but then they end up suppressing that related memory of Pinocchio. And that's in fact what we do see. So this is the actual data from children on average age 10, teens average age 15, and then emerging adults at 20 and 25. And so I'm going to highlight 2 things. So again, the purple dots are the children. And so as we predicted, they don't reactivate. They treat those 2 image pairs as separate, right? They learn the barrel and the backpack go together very well, and they learn the barrel and Pinocchio go together, but they don't relate them together in memory. I'll point out the orange and the yellow, so the emerging adults, right? They actually do reactivate across repetitions, so you can see them reactivating Pinocchio as they're learning about the backpack and the barrel, and so they're connecting these things in their memory. But teens, again, do something very interesting. They initially reactivate, but then they end up suppressing that memory. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but what's interesting here is that adolescence is not just a linear development from childhood. There's something that's special about this phase in life that makes them different than even a 10-year-old. And so we'll talk about what that is in a sec. But we can also, so teens suppress the memory, children don't reactivate, and the adults actually reactivate things and connect them to memory. And so we can relate this to the behavior on this task. So how well does their ability to reactivate on those second and third repetitions impact their ability to reason? So on this kind of what's called the y-axis, the upward axis, that's the probability that they get the inference judgments correct. So 1 in this case is they do perfectly at this task. And on this x-axis, you can see how much they reactivate across these second and third repetitions. So what I'm going to point out to you here is that the curves for the yellow and the orange lines are the older participants. So the more they reactivate, the better they do on this task. The line goes upward. You have the opposite consequence for children. The more they reactivate, the worse they do at this task. That is not an effective strategy for children and teens, which I think is an interesting thing to think about. They can both do this task, but they do it via different mechanisms, right? Because their brains have different capacity at this stage. So the way to think about this is the way that children might best reason about this is that they have these individual memories stored in their brains, the two individual premise pairs, and at the time of test, they have to remember both of them and then recombine them on the fly to make that reasoning judgment. Adults, in contrast, have kind of formed these combined or linked memory representations. So in the reasoning judgment, they already know that the backpack and the Pinocchio share a relationship, and so they're faster and more accurate at making these kinds of decisions. So while they can both do these tasks, the strategies are very different with different kind of computations and consequences. And we can also show that when actually doing these reasoning behaviors, so we can scan them also while they're doing these reasoning tasks, we show that these different strategies by which they do the task are reflected in the maturation of the lateral parietal cortex. So adults activate this region more, and they tend to activate it using this kind of computational strategy more often. So what I'm going to argue, not just from my own lab's data, but from other data, is that why teens may differ from both children as adults is that their brains are wired to explore the world. And so suppressing experience during new learning experiences can be adaptive because it allows you to gather as much new information about your environments as possible. So I'll give you another example from Michael Drew, who does a lot of rodent fear conditioning. So this is an example of a rodent study looking at kind of a similar phenomenon as what I just described to you. So here, this is called contextual fear conditioning. You stick a mouse or a rat, in this case they were rats in the study, in a chamber, and it has a kind of floor grid. And when placed in this chamber, you actually give them a mild foot shock. And so what a rodent will do in a situation like that is freeze, right? That's their fear behavior. And so in this kind of task, like if you stick a child, a teen, and an adult rodent, in this kind of behavior, they'll freeze when you shock them. But what happens is when you wait a day or two later to test their memory, so you just stick them back in the environment and see if they freeze, right? So if they remember being shocked, they'll automatically freeze. What happens is the kids do that, so they freeze when you place them back in the context a day later. So do the adult rats. But what's interesting is the teen rats do not, right? And it's not because they've forgotten that memory. They actually, through work, they show that they suppress it through these memory regions of the brain. So they're actively suppressing this information. What's also fascinating is they stuck these teenage rats back in the context after they had fully matured into adulthood, and they immediately froze in the context. So that again shows you it's not because they forget what they learned, they just temporarily suppress the memory for a bit. And so what I'd argue is that things like this, this is an example where these kinds of memory suppression may confer risky behavior, which is often more frequent in adolescence. But I'd also argue it's a very optimal state for learning, right? Because you're gathering as much as the world, right? Whereas a child and an adult may assume that the context is the same and so they should freeze, the teen doesn't. They're saying, well, maybe the situation has changed. I need to collect more data about it before I make a decision, right? And that's often what if you are parents or have been parents of teenagers, you'll often appreciate that about teenagers. You can tell them from your own experience what they should do, and they're going to be like, no, I'm going to figure it out for myself. And this is an example of that. Right? Okay, so while that particular stage of development may be adaptive, right? When you need to learn as much about the world as possible, the kind of mature brain where we're linking these memory together have lots of other benefits. So I've shown you one for reasoning, but my lab studies all of these. It might help you learn conceptual knowledge, like what does justice mean? You can't learn that from a single instance. You have to learn that over many, many different experiences. It also helps us learn to navigate our environments flexibly. and I mean actually navigate, and I'm going to talk about that. It allows you to generalize knowledge in situations, right? Because you can take, again, one information learned in one setting and apply it to another. But divergent thinking, right? You mentioned this kind of idea of imagination and creating novel solutions. This is another way that kind of linking memories and seeing these novel connections that you haven't directly experienced in the environment can help you learn these things. And my lab studies all these things, and I don't have time to talk to you about them all, so I'm going to give you one last example before I stop, which is about navigating and generalization. So we can see also, in this task, again, we stick children and adolescents and adults in the scanner, but here they actually interact in a virtual environment. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see actually what it looks like. They're in like a meadow arena, and there are mountains all around them, and they're hunting for these friendly monsters. And so what you see on the top is an aerial view, right? You can see the kind of the cartoons of the 4 monster cues. You can see the whole circular meadow. And during a learning trial, they start in that gray dot, and then they'll see the orange monster will be visible, and so they navigate to the orange monster to learn its location, and then after they do that, the green monster will appear and they navigate to that, and then the next monster, number 3, will appear, and so on and so forth. So through these learning trials, they learn where these monsters are located in the environment. And we can also then test their memory for these things. So again, we spawn them in a place in the environment, and we tell them, go tell me where the orange monster is. And so they navigate a route through this here, indicated by this dotted line, and then they press a button. And where they press the button is the black dot. And after that, they press a button, the monster will appear, right? And here they're showing they're close, but they're a little off. And so they'll navigate as feedback to the monster's location. So across these kind of trial and error, they learn where these monsters are located. But we can see this is performance across age. You can kind of ignore like the columns because they're just different conditions where the monsters are linked to either the mountains or a traffic cone in the environment. But you can see each of the dots represents where a given subject hit the button, right, for the location. And you can see that the spatial memory gets more accurate across age. So adults are better in general at navigating than young children are, and that continues to improve through adolescence. And so the first thing we can ask is like, okay, given their behavior, we might expect that the precision at which people locate and represent these objects in the environment might change with the development, where the adults really differentiate their neural representations about these things. The monsters will activate different populations of neurons, and they'll be able to discriminate their locations more easily, whereas in the children, kind of overlapping purple circles represent where they're activating overlapping populations of neurons, and so those locations are more confusable to them. And so to test that, we can again use kind of machine learning algorithms to look at the similarity between the monsters when they first are exposed to them in the first run that they learn, and then at the end of this kind of learning, which is run 3, and we can see how similar they are. And it turns out in the hippocampus, adults actually differentiate these things. So the representations of the monsters become more discriminable, right, across learning. They're able to better locate them in space consistent with their behavior. And children and adolescents show that much less of a degree. But what I really want to show you about this data is this idea about generalization. So do children and teens actually generalize knowledge the same way adults do? So they've all learned this to some degree or other. But what I didn't tell you about this task is they first learned these 4 monsters, but then they also saw a second set where the 4 new monsters were presented in the environment, and this time they shared locations with the original monsters. So the brown one was located in the same place as the purple one, the blue one, same place as the green one, etc. And so the question is, you can use your existing knowledge of the first monster location information to help you rapidly learn the second, right? And so the question is, what happens here? And so we can ask, like, how much does the neural representation for the first set of monsters look similar to the second set of monsters? And what we see here, again, in a different part of the hippocampus, one of these memory regions, you can see that adults actually show more similarity. So this bar is above 0. So this increased similarity means that the new monsters elicit the same kind of neural populations as the first set of monsters. So they're using that pre-existing knowledge to help them navigate the next set of monsters. And it turns out that the children do the exact opposite. They actually discriminate these 2 object sets in memory, right? They keep them separate in their memories, which is going to limit their ability to navigate in these kinds of environments and make them worse at these kind of spatial tasks. So across these different behaviors, what we've seen is that adults construct knowledge, right? So memory are really building blocks to help us, anticipate the future by linking experiences across time. And that children and teens tend to keep different experiences separate in their memory. And that actually has consequences for many different kinds of memory-based decision-making. So I've given you some examples tonight of reasoning, risk-taking, navigation, and generalization, right? So the idea that children's and teens' brains work differently in storing memories than adults has many consequences beyond just remembering itself. And that one of the things that kind of work like this, and in both my lab and others who do similar work, is that this suggests that given an individual learner's brain state, you might want to use a different educational strategy during teaching, right? So how you teach an 8-year-old might need to differ from how you teach a 12-year-old, from how do you teach a 16-year-old to how you teach a 25-year-old, because their brains have different capacities and they learn in very different ways. So the same kind of strategies might not have the same consequences depending on how old you are. And so with that, I'll stop and we can move to our panel, but I'll just give it, if you're interested in my lab's work or about participating in our studies, this is the same QR code, and so you can check out our lab's website and some of our other work. And I'm just going to thank all the funders who over time have funded all of our various work on this topic and others. And with that, I think we can, you can start submitting questions while we do our little reconfiguring. Yes?
Okay, so like I mentioned, we have Synapse members with microphones, so if you want to ask a question in your own voice, just raise your hand and they'll run to you. Meanwhile, I'll be scanning the questions that you've been submitting and we'll go back and forth. Does somebody want to start us off with the old-fashioned way?
So with the monsters one, it was just you show them 4 locations of the monster, they find them, then you disappear them and you ask them to find them again.
Yeah. But they learn that over many, many trials. So they get many exposures to the monsters. So they get about 12 exposures to each monster to be able to learn to that degree of precision. Yeah.
Okay, so do you change the locations or the same location? They just get closer and closer? Or?
No, they stay in the same locations within a run. And then there's a trick we do, which is if you are into spatial navigation, we actually rotate them across runs, which requires you to form a more cohesive map.
Oh, you start them at a random location, but the actual...
The person is in a random location, but the monsters are always in stable locations.
Yeah, the shape of the monsters stay the same.
Yeah.
In relation to the arena too.
Yeah.
It's just they start at random location. Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just want to say at the outset that we have about 90 questions, so we'll get to as many of them as we can. But what a great sign!
I love the curiosity.
So
yes.
Let's start with the first one. Is somebody asked, are there gender implications with things like this?
Yeah, so we don't see a lot. So we do test males and females, and we look for gender differences, but we don't see a lot of gender differences in the data that we show. The one thing where you do see some kind of subtle gender differences is related to puberty, and so the onset of puberty determines when you're kind of technically an adolescent, and so we know that girls tend to start puberty earlier than boys, and so in that kind of 8 to 12 range, you'll have slight offsets in when puberty is happening in boys and girls, which kind of confer very stereotypical kind of patterns. But in these kinds of tests, we don't see huge gender differences in them, no.
I feel like I understand my 15-year-old in a very different way right
That's
now.
Awesome.
Compared to my 20-year-old, which I wasn't expecting. But I have 2 questions. One, anthropologically, is there implication 100 years ago, 200 years ago, was this different? And I know we don't have the data sets, but I'm wondering what your hypothesis is there.
So no, because the evolution takes thousands, if not millions of years. And so our brains were evolved for when humans were, tens of thousands of years, right? When we were still hunter-gatherers. So keep that in mind. I do think there's some interesting things that we look at and that our society has certainly changed. So, there's the Industrial Revolution, right? That was one big change. Our probably biggest change most recently is the digital revolution, right? too. And so our brains, one of the things that I could show you different slides about this, I don't have them in this deck. But one thing we're really concerned about is things like media multitasking. Our brains are not built for that kind of behavior. And all of us, I'm guilty of it too, will be watching TV and like be on our phones, right? Like your brain is incapable of doing two things at once, like except breathing, right? So it's homeostatic things it can do, like things that you just regulate your body, your heart rate, your blood pressure. But things involving like cognitive performance, you can do one thing at a time. And we're increasingly in a world where we have a lot of information being thrown at us at once, and our brains are not adapted to that. And so that does, media multitaskers, you do see consequences in cognitive behaviors for people who are more likely to engage in media multitasking. And there are some actual emerging developmental studies in the past, like only couple years, because it's taken a while to get the data, is that children who are more likely to do media multitasking actually have changes in their brain connectivity patterns that are different than those that don't. It's unclear what that means in the long term, because again, this data is just emerging. Yeah. So our brains are really adapted for like tens of thousands of years ago, but we live in a very different environment right now, and that's an interesting to think about. And other scientists actually are investigating those kinds of questions.
Thank you. And I wonder, does trauma have an implication for this in youth and adolescents?
So I don't study this myself, but a very rich area of research over the past like 10 or 15 years is looking at early life adversity in particular. And so trauma at the youngest ages, like toddlerhood and before, has major consequences for the development of brain structure and function in very adverse ways. And so some of the initial work on this topic was for very extreme trauma. So children who were institutionalized, like meaning in orphanages, which had not very interactive or environmentally rich interactions. So they were deprived of social interactions, like with caregivers and others. And those kinds of individuals, you'll see delays in like structural and functional development that have long-term consequences. And so there is a lot of work looking at other forms of trauma too. And maybe Michael can say something about just how trauma affects the brain in general, whether it's during development or not. It has a particularly adverse effect if it happens early, but it also can have other adverse effects later in life too. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah. So first of all, my lab works at a completely different level of analysis than Ali. So Ali mentioned that one rat study, and that's kind of like the work that we do. We use rodent models, mice in particular, and so we can understand the cells and the circuits that are mediating memory. And one of the topics that we're especially interested in now is memory for traumatic events. There's been a lot of work over the years showing that, of course, these traumatic memories are really durable. And so, for instance, in our mouse models, we, like in the experiment that Ali showed, when you do an experiment like that in adult mice, so you put them into a chamber and they get like a single foot shock that hurts but is not damaging. They essentially remember that for the rest of their lives. And so these traumas recruit these very durable memory mechanisms that induce plasticity that's extremely long lasting. Trauma is something, it's a very layered thing. So there's a mnemonic component, so we form memories of trauma. There are also stress hormones that are recruited that can affect our brains in powerful ways. There's another line of research that my lab has worked on about in our hippocampus. We have the capacity to, so actually throughout life, we have the capacity in a part of our hippocampus to continue to generate new nerve cells, new neurons, neurogenesis. And that's something, this neurogenesis process is very sensitive to stress. And so undergoing stress can suppress neurogenesis, and that could potentially have long-term effects. So stress and trauma is a really powerful stimulus that our brain is really sensitive to.
So there was a question about if kids aren't as good at this learning and are kind of by design don't do as well, why are they so good at learning language?
So that actually is a very different kind of form of learning. And I'd argue that things like that, so that we call that statistical learning. So where you're picking up statistics of the environment. And it can be supported by different brain regions that I talked about tonight, but it takes thousands and thousands and thousands of trials to learn language. This is very different than kind of learning that I was talking to you about, which is kind of single shot or maybe a few shots to learn. Those kind of different learning are subsumed by different memory systems, some of which develop earlier than others. But there's emerging work that kind of things like statistical learning, like involved in language, where you're, again, just picking up the rhythm of how language unfolds in time, that actually continues to refine in many ways into adolescence too. Language is a special category because it has a critical period up to the age of 7, but other forms of statistical learning continue to refine through adolescence. So there are many ways that even infants can learn individual episodes, but they just don't learn them as well as adults. So there may be some early capacities, but we continue to get better as we do.
Is there somebody holding a microphone or? Okay, if you have one, raise your hand. So in the meantime, did we have one? In the meantime, there was a question about can you give concrete examples of how we should teach kids at those different ages differently, given what? So just kind of sum up like the summary version of how we should treat them differently.
I think we don't know all the answers to the questions for that. I wish I did, right? That's kind of like where we didn't understand even these fundamental principles. Like I said, even 20 years ago, we thought a 6-year-old's brain looked like a 25-year-old's. So we're only kind of getting to these fundamental mechanisms. But what's interesting is like in a task very similar to what I talked about, but I'll give you into a kind of semantic learning context. So I can teach you a fact, right? So all baby kangaroos are called joeys, right? I might give you a different fact at a later time. Blue fires are a type of kangaroo. And I can ask a child or you later, what is a baby blue flyer called? And the answer is a joey, right? So kids like 4 to 6 are less likely to answer those questions correctly. You can give them instruction to try to link those two facts together in memory to learn that baby blue flyers are joeys, but they still don't do it well. So even if you bootstrap them, there may be some fundamental limits on what a young child's brain can do. And so one of the best things that you have to do is repeated exposure, right? So the more that you actually expose a child to things, so if you give an adult a few learning repetitions, they'll learn really well, but it might take triple or 5 times that amount to have a child learn that the same way. So that's one of the things we know. Another thing that's a good one is having them generate the knowledge themselves by guiding them through the process. So one of the most common kind of study techniques that works well at all ages is something called the testing effect. So you may be used to, from your own school days, like you would read your chapter in a textbook and take some notes, and that's what we refer as studying, right? But what's much more effective is if you actually give yourself a test on that knowledge, where you have to test your ability to recall it and generate it from your memory. That actually ends up being a much more durable form of memory that lasts over time. And so getting kids to practice recalling knowledge, similar to kind of this repetition, can make children better. So one general thing is you have to bootstrap them more because they don't have the same natural capacities. So even in young adults, like when I teach like neuroscience to young adults, like there are some principles about neural communication that you can use your high school physics for. Like the right-hand rule in physics is useful for thinking about how neurons transduce electrical conduction. Some kids might automatically think about that when you're talking about neurons, but not all kids do. So you might actually have to reactivate that knowledge for them. You might have to introduce the right-hand rule before you talk about the new information, like how neurons work. And that can help bootstrap children too. So I think that's the general rule, is there just needs to be more support at younger ages. But I'll honestly point out there may be some fundamental limits even when you do that.
Cool. By the way, so most of these brainstorms are on the UT Brainstorms channel on YouTube, and we've done several on this studying thing and about studying with recall. So,
So I'm wondering about the effects of long-term stress. And I understand that part of the brain will lose neurons and part of it will gain neurons. If somehow you relieve the stress after a while, is that reversible?
On the neurogenesis effect. Yeah, well, so it's interesting. So, different parts of our brains are obviously adapted for different functions. And the hippocampus, the memory region that Ali was mentioning before, is important for forming new declarative memories, episodic memories, remembering our experiences. But it's a big structure, and it has in animals we call it a dorsal part and a ventral part. And actually they're specialized differently. And so the dorsal part we usually think about as more cognitive, and the ventral part is more emotional. Ventral part is really part of our limbic system that really is involved in regulating emotions. And so one of the really interesting phenomenon is the dorsal part and the ventral part respond differently to stress hormones. So when you release stress hormones, those hormones actually can suppress plasticity in the dorsal, this cognitive part of the hippocampus, but enhance it in the ventral part of the hippocampus. And so this plasticity is what allows memories to form. And so, one of the things that I think happens when we are experiencing a lot of stress is that it changes how we code memories. And my own lab has some recent evidence for this, is that when animals, in this case animals, are stressed, it actually enhances the coding of new memories in the ventral hippocampus, and it might suppress it in the dorsal hippocampus. So it actually changes how we process and remember events. And so the effects on neurogenesis actually seem to occur in both the dorsal and ventral hippocampus. But they are reversible usually, unless it's like severe, very long periods of stress, at least in the animal models. But what's one of the things to take away is that stress is not just impairing function all over the brain. It's actually enhancing functions in parts of the brain, but in ways that could be maladaptive. And it's yeah.
Thank you. I'm a grandmother, so I'm looking to reach out to my grandson. How can you teach, give a life experience, share a life experience, in spite of apparent boredom or lack of focus, or I just don't even care? How do you get attention to learning?
So adolescents are highly sensitive to rewards, more so than adults, right? When you associate simple tasks like this, when you associate image pairs with real money, and you get more money for remembering more things, you see two things. Behaviorally, the adolescents will show more of a reward-based memory effects. They'll remember more of the rewarding things than even adults do. So adults benefit from that too, but adolescents even more. But what's interesting, that's corresponded to like greater engagement of reward-sensitive brain regions during learning. So they show bigger responses in those reward-sensitive regions than the adults do, that are predictive of how big their memory benefit is. So adolescents are really sensitive to like exploring the environments. They like being rewarded for that. And you have to find out what motivates them and reward them with it. And that actually helps. Positive reinforcement is always better than negative reinforcement. And variable reinforcement is better than consistent reinforcement too. So surprising them with rewards can actually be even more beneficial at times. So we often we spend a lot of time in my lab. Like we stick kids in scanner, like they're not laying in the scanner for 3 hours, but our sessions with them, they're kind of in and out of the scanner for 3 hours, and we have to motivate them the whole time. And so we motivate them not necessarily for exactly the decisions they're making, but the longer they last in the task, the bigger the prizes they can get for participating in the experiments. And so that's actually really motivating to people too. So you just have to know your grandson well enough to understand what motivates him. Yeah. Money is, most teens, it's money.
I love that question. And, one thing to remember is that, the computer is in some ways a terrible metaphor for the brain, right? A computer remembers anything and everything that we tell it to remember. And our brains are not designed to do that, right? Our brains are really designed to remember stuff that's important to us, right? That has predictive value, that's going to affect our behavior, affect our outcomes. And so that's the other thing to think about. But in addition to being neuroscientists, we're all educators. And so we deal with this in the context of teaching as well. One of the things that always drives me nuts, and it happens in our neuroscience department, and some faculty will complain, we teach this one concept in the first year, and then when the students get to my class in the second year, they never remember it. And it kind of drives me nuts, because you know what? If the students really needed to remember it, and they're really using that information regularly, they would remember it. And the reason they're not remembering it is because it doesn't matter until they come around and they take your class.
Yeah, and go ahead.
The other thing I was going to say is curiosity is self-motivating. So it turns out that you are actually better at remembering things about you're curious about, right? So there just may be some topics that you're never motivated by, right? And I see this with my daughter who's in college now, right? Like she'll have to take some classes. She'll do fine, but when she's really dedicated to the topic, right, she learns much better and much more effectively. So even self-motivation, you don't have to pay them. If you interact with them with things they're curious for, that actually has positive benefits too. Yeah.
So I teach Neuroscience 1, and so I'm teaching the kids that end up forgetting things when...
You need to make them more interested.
Well, hang on. And so just to make her point, I talk a lot to the students, like, how do we get people to come to class? How do, and points. So as offensive it is to me to treat a 20-year-old like a kid and give points for coming to class.
They are still kids
I do,
in terms of their brains.
Right? I do, and so they show up, and then I practically force them to study in the way that Allie mentioned. And slowly over time now, that they're reporting to me that they haven't forgotten everything. And I like to motivate them by saying, what's the point of being in college? If you forget everything, if you fall semester, you forget something that you can't even remember spring semester. And so part of it is on the professors to insist that they study in a way so that they don't just study the night before and get an A, which means giving them very difficult exams and just beating on them constantly. You have to study this particular way, okay? So numerous questions that want to hold your feet to the fire, and you did the teaser about you've done experiments like this in older people. So we want a 5-minute synopsis of the...
So it's interesting. So some of the things that we see is like the things that come online earliest are the things that actually fade earliest, and the things that come on latest are some of the things that stay online latest. So you see this mirror reverse. So in some ways, this kind of ability to generalize and make connections, older brains up to a point are up to like kind of through middle age are actually still remain pretty good at that. You're good at building these kind of what I call fuzzy adaptive memories, where you're not remembering the specifics, but you're kind of doing what Michael said, getting the core dimensions of that experience that are most predictive of future things. So you don't focus on details, you focus on generalities, right? And what you lose, but children are really good at remembering more details because they have all these individual memories. They have high dimensional memories. And they're bad at coming up with like general principles and these kind of episodic memory tasks. They're learning about these signal events. And so you kind of see the mirror reverse. You lose this ability to remember details much earlier in aging. Like I'm in middle age now, and I'm seeing like my ability to recall names is much diminished from what it was like even 5 years ago. But I'm really much better than I was even 10 years ago at really seeing like the forest for the trees, right? So you can kind of see things that like are mirror reverse, right? And how aging unfolds. Like, so our brains get more adaptive about learning things that are right 80% of the time, right? That's kind of your brain as a heuristic machine, right? You're coming up with rules and knowledge that will help you make the right choices 80% of the time. And maybe that other 20%, you might have to have really, really detailed memories, but it's probably not worth your brain storing all that stuff. Whereas kids, they're much more focused on like details. Like, I don't know, I remember like when my kids are teenagers now, or in their early, like I have a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old. So I live what I research every day. And, but I remember when they were little, I would go to 1,000 birthday parties, and they all blurred together for me. And I would get this general like sense of these birthday parties because always the same kids there, generally the same things happen. And I wouldn't pay attention to the details, but my kids could remember exactly like who did what, when at each of those parties. And their memories are just meant to like collect as much data as possible. But as we age, we like collect these generalities that are very adaptive. And so that stays online longer. And so that's what we've seen is this kind of mirror reverse in how the changes in the brain work. And one of the first brain regions to age is actually the hippocampus, partly because it is so susceptible to stress hormones. And so you will see like the impacts of long-term stress will produce like kind of earlier aging, for instance, of the hippocampus, which has like negative consequences. And, there's other things. I mean, somebody's going to ask me this question, so I'll answer it now. So what are the things you can do to protect your brain and have a healthy aging? Somebody wants to ask that, right? Like you want to know the answer. So your brain is an organ like every other organ in your body. So the things that you know to do to protect your heart from cardiovascular things are the same things you can do to protect your brain. So we've already talked about one, reducing stress, eating a healthy diet, right, to help, because again, metabolic syndrome actually is related to kind of mild cognitive impairment and earlier, more kind of cognitive decline with age. So, and exercise, right? Exercise actually can stimulate neurogenesis, at least in mouse models, we know that. And so exercise, healthy eating, reducing stress, getting sleep deprivation and disrupted sleep has negative consequences for anybody of any age, but particularly older adults. And then a couple of the things that are emerging from, maybe some of you have read about superagers, right? So actually one of the biggest predictors of superagers, these are people who are in their 90s and still function the way they did when they were 60. Socialization, right? That's actually one of the biggest predictors of healthy aging. Is those that are socially isolated are less likely to have really healthy aging trajectories. So that's like a big one that's become very predominant because of the superager research. And then another one is actually challenging your brain with new things, like challenging your brain to learn. So if you've been a fan of Sudoku for the last 20 years, you might want to switch to something else. You might want to teach yourself chess or Go or a new language or learning a new instrument. So it's good to keep doing your Sudoku, but you want to challenge things to like have your brain form new neural connections right through life. So that's another big one. But honestly, socialization, right, is I think one that's underappreciated until recently.
Can I add a couple?
Yeah. You have a mic.
There's a really amazing study. So people have, I have to think, people have studied how memory and cognition declines with age. And then people have measured how much sleep deprivation impairs it. And if you index that with the typical sleep problems that older people had, you can explain about 80% of that decline with sleep. So sleep is huge. And I will say, just on a personal note, my mom had Parkinson's disease. She died a couple years ago. Of course, I read everything I could read about Parkinson's disease, and one of the things that I read was there will be cognitive decline, right? But I can tell you that her Parkinson's disease meant she didn't go out very much and she stopped socializing. And I guarantee you that the majority of her cognitive decline was because she just stopped interacting with people. So it's not a small thing, right? Yeah. So thank you.
I think what you both mentioned is great. I'll just add one other thing, which is like effort. I think we tend to think that our memory is just this thing that happens magically and passively, and we're going through life and we should just remember stuff. But that's not really true. And we do these terrible things like distracting ourselves constantly with our little devices that really impair our memory. And a lot of having a good memory is putting that effort, that attentiveness into it, and taking care to try to remember stuff, and that can help a lot.
Yeah. So, Michael, there were several questions about PTSD, and if I paraphrase them, the idea was why are these traumatic memories so difficult to undo?
Oh boy, if I can answer that one.
Right. Good
yeah.
luck. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, PTSD is not one thing, and so one of the things, so PTSD, there are a constellation of symptoms that go with it. People can relive traumatic events. It's kind of a memory-based symptom. People can be hyper-reactive to other stimuli and threats, which is more of an emotional type reaction. People can they can have sleep disturbances, self-destructive behaviors, avoidance. There are a whole constellation of different symptoms that are involved in PTSD that make it pretty challenging to study. It might not just be one thing. And so one of the things that we do in animal models, the field has changed over the last 20 years, where I think 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, people were trying to develop a mouse model of PTSD. And you just can't really do it. But what you can do is you can model specific symptoms. And that's what people call an endophenotype approach now. And so now what we try to do, and I think this has been relatively successful, is we try to model specific symptoms of diseases. And so in PTSD, for instance, one of the things that my lab has had success in doing is modeling that stress, that hyperactivity to stressors that you see in PTSD. And so, for instance, with a patient who has PTSD, if a car backfires, you might startle a little bit, but someone with severe PTSD might have a much more exaggerated reaction to it. And that's something that we can model really well in the animals, in mice in particular. And so, one of the things that we've seen is that there are certain brain regions that modulate that kind of response that become hyperreactive after stress and can remain that way for a very long time. So that's one of the really interesting things that we're looking into now. And what was the question now? Can you get rid of PTSD? And so there's no cure for PTSD, but there are both psychological treatments, different types of cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy that are effective. There are also drugs that are effective, but there's no targeted treatment for really any psychiatric illness right now that cures the illness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been paraphrasing most of these questions because this one's I'm going to read, okay? How does Carl Frischen's active inference theory describing the brain as a predictive engine geared toward minimizing surprise relate to your research?
There's like a student in this class. Minimizing surprise relating to inference. So I think your brain is trying to minimize surprise. If your brain was perfectly like a supercomputer and could remember every bit of information given to it, you would be perfectly predictive. Nothing would be surprising to you, right? Because you will have formed all these kind of associations. But again, we have limited capacity systems, right? You actually reach your peak memory behavior, and it's going to be sad to hear, at 25. So your brain matures at 25. And then it starts to decrease in its capacity pretty quickly. So fun times. If you're 25, live it up right now. your peak memory performance. But I think we have limited capacity systems. So our brains aren't perfectly predictive. And so I think Karfesten's model is you're trying to reduce prediction error, right? The way that you're trying to build these adaptive, connected models of memory is so that you can, again, 80% of the time not be surprised, right? But you can't be perfect at that, right? 20% of the time you're not going to fail, and there's going to be something that deviates from what you expected. That's just the limits of the system. I'm using rough numbers, like don't hold me to the 80-20 thing. But really, that's what the brains are doing. It's trying to build these models that will get you the biggest benefits in your behavior most of the time, and that is through surprise reduction.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a question from a UT neuroscience major back here who's in my class this fall. So here,
Guys,
here
he's calling me
is a
out.
professional question right here. Go.
Okay, I'll stand. I'm kidding. Oh, okay. I wrote my question down because I'm so nervous. I've never asked out loud before.
Good for you.
Thank you so much. Okay. I have a job right now, and I work with children. So this is like jumping back to children.
Yeah.
And it's teaching. So I do computer science learning with them. And it might be a little bit silly, but you talked about the different effects for like learning and memory formation and what. And I was kind of wondering about, like, I took AP Psych. I'm just an intro neuro student. But I was wondering about spacing effect. Because I'm trying to teach them, like, Dr. Mock talked about like good studying habits and like active recall and whatnot. And I think I'm trying to like think of ways for children to learn how to like study better. And if there's like a too much or a too little or like a good spacing or learning effect.
To describe to the audience what the spacing effects is. So the best way to explain this is you can have massed versus spaced practice. Massed practice is cramming the night before a test, and spaced practice is again, studying or testing yourself across a longer interval, a couple weeks or a whole month before that test, right? So that's the difference between mass versus spaced practice. So it turns out on the immediate test, like cramming will actually do you pretty well. You might get a couple more points in the spaced practice, but if I go back and ask you to remember that information 6 months later, the people who crammed and did the mass practice will not remember anything, and the people who do spaced practice will remember that in the long term. So that's what's called mass versus spaced practice. So one way people do this in kind of educational environments, it's what's called circular curriculum, right? This kind of like, you can think of it as a whirlpool, right? So if you think of time going like up in the whirlpool and the topics you cover being the circles, often you revisit things like as a teacher that you taught earlier in the semester. Like you bring it back for them multiple times. So you may encourage them to do spaced practice versus massed, but you also as a teacher might have to do like spaced introductions and repetitions across, especially when concepts relate to one another. Something you taught in week 2 might be something that you need to reference in week 6. And so doing a little primer or having them do a quiz about the week 2 stuff right before you teach the week 6 stuff is a way to help them, as a teacher, instantiate mass practice in the way that you instruct, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I'm thinking about these things a lot. So I mean, the spacing effect, I think, is one of the most fascinating effects, I think, in neuroscience. The other thing I would say is, active learning versus passive learning. We learn much better when we're actually trying to use things, and it's really interesting sitting in a room like this. You know how this room is set up. So this is a classroom, and you know how it's set up with the stadium seating, right? It was set up for the old school version of college, where a faculty member like one of us would stand up here for an hour and talk at you, right? We would lecture, yeah, with or without cigarettes, yeah. Yeah. If you come to classes at UT now, it's not like that, right? We're talking at you a little bit, and then you're using that information, hopefully. And it's a much more effective way to learn things.
And have the students be the teachers. Actually, that's one of the best things you can do. So every time I teach, I learn. And so giving peer feedback and having do peer-to-peer instruction is actually another way that you can help, right, get effective teaching, because they have to learn the concepts in a different way to be able to explain them to somebody else versus reproduce them on a test for you. That is a very different form, and it's much more generative. So it's a form of active learning, but it's peer-to-peer active learning, and that's also a powerful way to reinforce things too.
Yeah, we practically beg our students to form study groups, because instead of just reading their notes, they talk to each other, and they practice saying things, and they're doing it from memory rather than reading. My students hate this. My final exam is worth 30% of their grade because I care about what they know at the end and not what they knew in the middle.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I teach writing intensive classes, right? And so we spend half of my classes where the peers are interacting with each other and giving feedback on writing to one another. And they actually learn from doing that more than me talking to them about the principles of good writing. So it's actually using that knowledge and seeing it put into practice that's like one of the most effective ways to teach.
So we just have a few minutes left, and so I want to do our speed round. If you have a question, raise your hand and shout it out. Oh, excellent. So speed round is that you ask a question and we only take 20 seconds to answer it. That way we're gonna get through a few more questions. So speed round begins now.
For children and adolescents, particularly in learning and memory and judgment, does ADHD have an impact?
Yes, it does. That's the bottom line. It actually impacts how they can attend to what's relevant or irrelevant in the world, and it makes it harder for them to actually tune out what's not necessary. So they have trouble with this kind of wording. This is something I actually do study, is how attention interacts with your ability to learn these kinds of things. So the answer is yes. I have a child, a daughter who has ADHD, so I both study it and I live it, and it's useful to be a neuroscientist sometimes.
Just shout it out. I'll repeat it.
Connection of this research with current AI models?
Yeah, I use AI in my research all the time. When we're using more naturalistic tasks, so we actually have people just watch movies, and then we have them freely recall movies, and then we use or listen to verbal stories, like listen to moth stories, right, from the radio, and recall them. And we'll use AI to actually learn about the information structure and what aspects of the information structure predict what people are going to remember. So yes, we use it all the time.
Okay. I see you have a microphone. Go.
Yes. Just in 20 seconds and less, what's your recommendation for, keeping up your memory and learning while using AI as a productivity tool?
Well, I think you have to challenge yourself, right? It's so easy to rely on AI for answers and kind of accept them passively. I think you have to challenge yourself to be a critical consumer of it, because if you're not doing that, I'm over the 20 seconds. You just got to do it.
I would say AI is good for rote things, which you're not learning, but like when you really have to learn something new, force yourself to find the information yourself.
The brain scans that are shown, what is the fidelity of the scan? Like to what degree, what's the size of the pixels?
The resolution?
Yes, thank you.
It depends. Like ours are, the ones I was showing you about 1.5 millimeter osteotropic, so there's tens of thousands of neurons in like a little voxel. The anatomical ones are at higher resolution, but we're talking about like many, 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 many brain cells in a pixel that we're talking about.
Real quick, we only have time for a couple more.
I work in adult learning, and we talk a lot about how adults need multiple modalities to be able to take and retain, process, and be able to actually apply learning. Is the same true for children and young adults?
Not necessarily, I would say. I don't think there's necessarily different things called learning styles, but the more you apply knowledge in diverse ways, and so that's where maybe the multimodal is having, so I would say it's probably not the multimodal, but the different application scenarios that are helping you learn it more deeply.
There's actually evidence that learning is better when it's effortful And one of the implications is you actually don't want people to learn in their favorite way. You want them to learn in one of their
Yeah, that's called desirable difficulties.
yeah. So
Yeah, you talked about in adolescent memory, they do something called pruning to suppress certain stuff. What kind of stuff are they actively pruning?
That's anatomical. So that actually, so your brain, like you have millions and trillions of connections, like these different white matter connections in your brain. There are trillions of them. And one thing that happens in all development, but in human development, it happens in the teenage years, you prune out millions of those connections during adolescence, right? So you start out with trillions and you reduce it down during adolescence. So you're refining the way that neurons talk to one another. And that's an anatomical process that happens.
Yeah, and that's experience dependent, actually. And so in children and adolescents, as this pruning is happening, a lot of that is dependent on the experience, and they have to have the right experience for that pruning to happen in the right way. So that's why those are such critical periods.
we only have the last question. I'm sorry.
Given the development of teen brains, what is it that happens to somebody who develops schizophrenia, for example?
Yeah, so I've done a little work on schizophrenia. So, schizophrenia is largely an inherited disorder. So most of the kind of cause of it is through genetic mutations. And so the onset of that happens usually in emerging adulthood. So late teenage years and the early 20s, like kind of the average. And so a lot of the brain regions that I showed you in pictures today are directly affected in schizophrenia. Like schizophrenia, again, is a very complex disease that has multiple impacts of it. But interestingly, one of the things that, so you'll see a lot of positive symptoms, like psychosis, hallucinations, those kinds of things. Then negative symptoms, there are a lot of cognitive impairments that are associated with schizophrenia. They actually have reduced memory functioning. They're less able to reason about the world. And I've done some work with collaborators looking at schizophrenia and how these brain regions change with that. It turns out the negative symptoms, the cognitive symptoms you see, even more so than the positive ones, are more predictive of how well you function in the world. So the more cognitive symptoms you have, the less able you're actually to function and live independently. So some of these changes in these brain regions that we talked about tonight are being impacted by schizophrenia with adverse consequences for their ability to function in the world. But again, it's very complex, right, that disorder, and there's a lot we don't yet know about it.
We have to stop. I'm sorry. So first of all, let's thank Allie and Michael. Thank you to our Synapse people for coming. Thank you so much. I don't know where she is, but thank you to Susan Cushman, who's the person who does all that. Couple of things. So go to utbrainstorms.com. We're building our schedule as we go. We're kind of making it up as we go here for a while. We're going to be changing venues depending on how things are going to go. We have parking vouchers because we've always been in venues where parking was free. So take one if you'd like. If you'd like to make a little donation to Brainstorms, then don't take one. But please do, because that's always been important to us. I know a lot of you didn't get your questions answered, so the easiest thing for you to do is my email address is mauk@utexas.edu. Just send me an email. I'll answer you back. Maybe not this weekend, but because the Astros have a big 3-game series with the Mariners. But we'll get your questions, and the questions are really the big part of what we're doing, all right? And I hope that you spread the word. I hope that we see you next time, and I hope we're in a bigger auditorium that's a lot more full than this. So drive safe. Thank you for coming.